Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Peter Coplin, and I'm Secretary of the Toronto Medical Historical Club. On behalf of our President, Dr. Alan Lossing, I want to welcome you to what is our 516th meeting. For your interest, the first occurred back in 1924. We are collaborating today with the Department of Molecular Genetics, and I would like to thank Dr. Leah Pawson and Diane Wells, the department administrator, for their partnership in bringing this historical retrospective together. I would also like to thank Mr. Gary Goldberg for his support and most of all for his patience in bearing with us in the various iterations of this event earlier in the year, as the COVID virus slowly wrapped its tentacles around us all. We are also very grateful to Heather Bannister and the academic and campus events team at the University of Toronto for their help and guidance. If you are inspired at the conclusion of this event to undertake a little medical history with us, we would welcome your participation. We have a new website, and as you might guess, it's www.torontomedicalhistoricalclub.ca. There's one little housekeeping item that I would like to bring to your attention. On your toolbar, there is a little box with a question mark in it. This is the only way that you're able to ask a question today. And if you click on that and write your question, it will be fielded by our team. I'm now going to turn the meeting over to Dr. John Dirks, one of our club members, who, as you know, has left his medical footprints in Winnipeg, Montreal, Vancouver, and in Pakistan. He is the Emeritus Director of the Gairdner Foundation here in Toronto, and really the driving force between what I think is going to be a wonderful historical perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. It's a privilege to be your host today and to embark on a program that's going to honor and pay tribute to Lou Siminovitch at 100. I'm going to cover much of Lou's history, and we will have interspersed at various times a number of speakers in Bob Phillips, in Ron Wharton, Jim Woodgett, Ken Knox, Kathy Siminovitch, and David Naylor. So we will have a number of speakers who will give their experience regarding a particular aspect of Lou's career. So in front of you, you see the picture of Lou in various times of his life. As a young boy there on the top, on my top right, as a viral scientist at OCI, and on your upper left, and then as in the middle when he received the Companion Order of Canada. Slide, please. Our organization today is going to include going through the various stages in Lou's life, beginning with the early years, through his time in Paris, and then through the various institutions at the University of Toronto and the teaching hospitals, CONNAUGHT, OCI, the MSB, the Sick Kids, and the LUNENFELD. And then we're going to go into his wider influence in Ontario with to talk about that, and we'll end further with Lou as a person and leader, and focus on Lou's interest in culture, the family, and at the end we will have a summing up by David Naylor and have a Lou respond to what he's heard during this day. Next slide, please. So we begin with Lou's early life. Lou was born in 1920. He was born in Montreal. There's a little confusion whether it was May 1st or May 15th. I think he was born on May 1st and registered on the 15th. He's always had the advantage of having 15 days of birthdays. And this year we celebrated the 100th at a time when we were going to have this tribute through a Zoom with several people doing that, and that worked very well. Lou's parents were Father Nathan from Romania, Mother Goldie from Russia, and they settled in Montreal and met there. And Lou's parents were living just above the poverty line. In his growing up, he had few frills. He went to the local schools. He says sometimes he never knew his parents too well. In Montreal, he went to the Strathcona Academy, which in the 30s was a bit of a leftist hotbed of frank communism. There was a fair bit of gambling going on, and Lou's attention was a little bit on that and baseball. But Lou then became a strong scholar, becoming very apt in mathematics. And I just put beside it the rule of fours, because Lou often talks about his great success in the rule of fours, where he got 96%. And I'll leave it to you to find out about the rule of fours. He entered McGill in 1937, chose honors chemistry for his BSc degree, and then entered into a PhD program in physical chemistry from 41 to 44, taking some of his studies at McGill and some of his time in Ottawa with the NRC, or the National Research Council. In Montreal, he met Eleanor, who typed his thesis. And when she learned that he was going to go to NRC in Ottawa, she suggested that they should get married. And he quickly answered this proposal with a yes. And they were married for over 50 years thereafter. So from 1944 to 1946, after the NRC in Ottawa, Lou was at Chalk River at the Canadian Atomic Energy Center, where he met many very able and smart physicists. He worked on isotopes such as phosphorus and sulfur, and he met these scientists and had interactions with them, including the famous Pontecorvo, who later defected to the USSR. This was the time of the Guzenko defection, which caused quite a stir in the Western world, Russia going from a friend to an enemy. Slide, please. And then Lou headed to Paris. And initially, I want to say that it appears to me, and in the discussions with Lou, where he's raised his wonderful time with Eleanor and his startup family from 1947 to 1953, this has shaped him for life. He saw what is meant to be in an excellent scientific environment, to have serious and intensive discussions about it regularly, about each experiment. He learned to be a biological scientist, as he was still a chemist, and he had no special training in biology, no special courses, but accepted at that time was you simply, if you were smart, joined the lab and learned it as an apprenticeship. And I think all this prepared him very well for his future in Toronto. Interesting, he became very fluent in French. And if you look at his CV, the first 25 papers are all in French. Lou and Eleanor lived most modestly in Paris, raising their growing family, but opening their minds to French culture of theater, architecture, music, and even the Moulin Rouge. Next slide, please. The way that Lou got to Paris was through Louis Rapkine, who was a chef de science at the Pasteur Institute. He was Lou's first mentor. Lou met him during his last days in Montreal in 1947. He met him at a lecture and asked Rapkine's advice about how he could switch his career from chemistry to biology. And Rapkine said, no problem. Immediately asked him to join the lab at the Pasteur Institute, which was directed at carbohydrate metabolism. Lou obtained I think an NRC fellowship and had this start that way. His work went very well. He published a number of papers, but Rapkine died quickly within a year of widespread cancer, so that Lou was bereft of a mentor. Fortunately, he was in the Pasteur Institute, and he was invited by André LWOFF to join him in his laboratory. Interesting, as later on in 2010, when the first Rapkine lecture was established in Paris, Lou was invited to present it. Slide, please. So now we're at the Pasteur Institute, and Lou is in the environment of André LWOFF, Monod, and Jacob. And
Working directly with LWOFF, who worked on lysogeny, Lou is gradually identifying his own experiments that he wished to tackle. And LWOFF suggested, was working lysogeny, and Lou suggested to him that he should try to increase the rate of mutation, because Lou had become very interested in mutation. The rate randomly was less than 1%. So he was asked, sure, try the experiment, but how should he do it? And Monod, who was skeptical, said, just shine UV light on your bacteria. And in the very first experiment, 100% induction of viral replication was evoked, proving that viral genomes were integral to cell genomes. Lou's comment on this is, one experiment from a framework of ignorance was the most seminal of my career and a major catalyst for the whole career. Next slide, please. So here we are, the three famous scientists that he was exposed to on a day-to-day basis. And in 1965, they all shared the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for their discoveries concerning genetic control of enzyme and virus synthesis. Lou became particularly close to Francois Jacob, who entered medical school as the Second World War began, and then left to join the French resistance movement, spent some time in London, and was severely injured due to German bombing. He was transferred to France and had a long time in recovering, and he decided that his medical career and his aim to become a surgeon could no longer be fulfilled. So he looked for laboratories to work on, and first did some work in a drug company on an antibiotic, and then came to the lab of Monod. Next slide. And they became partners ever since. Francois Jacob has left a huge imprint on Lou. And you might want to read the book that Jacob wrote just a few years ago, The Statue Within. Lou wrote this in May 26 as a memorial for Jacob. During one's career, one meets a plethora of individuals who impact on one's career. This was especially so in my very early days at the PASTEUR, where I worked in the presence of future Nobel Prize winners such as Monod, LWOFF, and Jacob, all superb scientists. But as is obvious from the autobiography, Jacob was more than DNA, RNA, and proteins. He was a citizen of science. He epitomized the importance of values and humanism. Despite our very different science trajectories, the seeds of friendship and mutual understanding that Francois and I shared never abated. He is one of the few people who truly enriched my life, well beyond the walls of the laboratory. In my view, Francois merits the highest of Judaism's accolades. He was a mensch. I suspect that Lou would write something similar about other colleagues he had as leaders in Toronto, for example, John Evans. Next slide, please. So Lou was looking for a career in Paris. He was offered an opportunity to stay in Paris, now having 3 daughters for children, and then decided it's time to return to Toronto. And again, by chance, as often happened in Lou's life, he met Angus Ray, who was in charge of the CONNAUGHT laboratories in Toronto. And they had a discussion, and Angus Ray offered him a position at the CONNAUGHT laboratories. He received a cancer fellowship and became a leader in the virus lab. And his accomplishment there, among others, he developed a unique animal cell culture suspension technique to grow cells. He was joined that lab by Gordon Whitmore and James Till, who was a postdoc. Next slide, please. What we're going to see over the next 20 years or more is Lou assuming progressively larger leadership positions. As you can see from this slide, in 1963 to 69, he was head of the Division of Biological Research at the Ontario Cancer Institute, or the OCI. In 69, he became chairman of the Department of Medical Cell Biology at the University of Toronto. In 1972, this became the Department of Genetics and later has been changed to molecular genetics in the Faculty of Medicine. Simultaneously, in 1970, he became geneticist in chief for the Hospital for Sick Children. And then in 1985, he was the founding director of the Samuel Lunenfeld Research Institute at Mount Sinai Hospital. Lou always states, "I have never applied for any position or responsibility. People came and asked. I took them on." Next slide, please. And Lou's career of changes can be summarized in his quotation. "I have a high mutation rate. I have enjoyed a great satisfaction from moving into new fields and addressing new challenges. I have moved from chemistry to biology, from bacterial viruses to a completely new field of somatic genetics." Slide, please. So to backtrack to the Ontario Cancer Institute, where he was recruited and invited by the famed histologist Arthur Ham to come to OCI. It was an extraordinary place, which again focused on excellence, world-class science, and a very interactive environment, not unlike what he had experienced in Paris. As noted before, he became a director of biological research quite quickly, again launching a succession of a lifetime career of leadership. He was there during the stem cell discovery by McCullough and Till, and Lou was very much part of some 30 essential papers relating to hemopoietic colony-forming cells. So we're now going to ask, as shown in the next slide, Bob Phillips, who was at OCI at that time, to comment on his time with Lou and others at the OCI.
Lou and friends of Lou's. It's a great honor for me to participate in this celebration of Lou's accomplishments on his 100th birthday. I've been asked to summarize his contributions at the Ontario Cancer Institute and how the Ontario Cancer Institute may have influenced Lou's attitudes toward research and administration. Lou joined the scientific staff of the Ontario Cancer Institute in 1957. Prior to that, Lou had worked at CONNAUGHT Labs, which had offered him a position when he returned from Paris in 1953. While at CONNAUGHT Labs, Lou came to know Arthur Ham, a well-known pathologist who had written a popular textbook that married tissue structure and cellular function. In 1956, Ham accepted a position as the director of the new research organization affiliated with Princess Margaret Hospital, and Ham asked Lou to come with him to the OCI to become one of the first faculty members in this new institute. To make sure he had at least a couple of research colleagues who were sympathetic to his genetics approach, Lou asked Ham if he could recruit 2 people. Ham agreed, and Lou soon rehired Clarence First and Rose Shannon. Later, after moving to the OCI, Ham asked Lou to actually take over as director of the Division of Biological Research so that Ham could focus on keeping his textbook up to date. Hence began Lou's career as a research administrator. Initially, Lou and Ham worked as a team to recruit new staff to their division at the OCI. Ham had a strong belief that the right strategy was to hire the best people and let them do their thing. He did not believe in recruiting to a specific area of research. He simply hired the best people available. He also did not believe in search committees. Lou became a proponent of these ideas and adopted them wherever he worked. All of Lou's research at the OCI was done in collaboration with other OCI scientists. Lambda-phage work with Clarence First, polyoma research with McCullough, Axelrod, Howitson, and Ham, hemopoietic stem cells with Till and McCullough, and somatic cell genetics with Whitmore. In addition, there's a collection of excellent students and postdocs who made important contributions and conceptual contributions to the research. A significant number of these trainees went on to develop their own successful independent research careers, many with major leadership responsibilities. In addition to Lou's impact on the OCI had several important impacts on Lou. During his time at the OCI, he refined his research program, developed skill at influencing science policy in Canada and internationally, and developed a philosophy about research on scientific excellence that he adopted every place he worked. One of Lou's ambitions when he returned to Canada was to start a program in mammalian somatic cell genetics. While working at Connaught Labs, he developed a method for growing large numbers of cells in suspension, so that all that remained was to select mutants. Lou had told many people of his plans and received many skeptical comments, mainly pointing out that in diploid cells, the probability of sustaining mutants could be very low, perhaps 10 to the minus 12. Nevertheless, Lou persevered, led by 3 postdocs, Larry Thompson, Bud Baker, Ralph Mankiewicz, and a sabbatical visitor, Jim Wright from Winnipeg. He succeeded in selecting Wabane-resistant mutants. This success rapidly stimulated several other groups in Toronto and elsewhere to set up similar programs. Both at the Pasteur Institute and the OCI, Lou saw the importance of scientific collaboration, open sharing ideas, and cross-fertilization provided by the interaction of scientists from different disciplines. These ideas, plus the strong support for different levels of scientific excellence and integrity, for the highest level of scientific excellence and integrity, were ideas that Lou implemented in all the programs that he led. At the OCI, Lou began his habit of writing letters to key leaders, advising them on better ways to carry out their mandate. One of his first letters was to the Medical Research Council, suggesting improvements in their grant program. This letter resulted in Lou becoming a member of MRC grant panels. Similar interactions with the National Cancer Institute of Canada led to Lou becoming chair of the Research Committee Advisory Committee on Research, a board member, and ultimately president of the NCIC. Throughout his career, Lou has served numerous advisory committees, universities, and governments, both in Canada and internationally. Many years later, after Lou and I had left the OCI, I took leadership positions in a couple of research funding and coordinating organizations and became a target for Lou's lobbying efforts. Generally, Lou supported increased funding for research and improvements in the creativity and excellence of the scientific community in Canada. In this context, over many enjoyable lunches and other discussions with Lou, I learned that Lou hated planning, especially for biomedical research. He bragged to many that he had never followed plans laid out in his research grant, nor did he create plans for the organization he led. Good science follows the leads of good research. That doesn't need a plan. What a career filled full of achievements without a plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. So we go back to the slides. So we move to the University Medical Science Building. Lou was invited sight unseen by the dean at that time, who had been the previous chairman of pediatrics, Dean Laurie Shute, to develop a new department because the big explosion that was taking place in the new molecular biology, and he did not think it was present in the MSB. So he just received a letter asking him to take this on, and he was hesitant, but was encouraged by Harold Johns and others at the OCI that he should do this. Initially, he was offered a lot of positions, 22, later reduced because there was a big budget austerity. Initially, his appointment in the MSB to be head of the Department of Medical Cell Biology led to a lot of opposition because it was thought that the
Existing departments already covered the subject of genetics. But Lou took off, and among the recruits were people like Paul Sadowski and Jeremy Carver and many others, and all the basic ingredients of good departments such as graduate programs were put in place. Last year, the 50th anniversary of the Department of Molecular Genetics was very well attended, and Lou was part of it. And also we know about the continuity of the departments of immunology and all its various forms since that time. Next slide, please. At the same time, while being at the MSB, he was invited in 1970 by the head of pediatrics at Sick Kids, Dr. Harry Bain, to create a department of genetics at Sick Kids. He was going to be geneticist in chief, never having trained specifically in genetics, but the goal was to use the new science in understanding childhood genetic diseases. Lou recruited key scientists, and this resulted in a fantastic blossoming of the understanding of genetic disease in children. These were the glory days at Sick Kids of gene cloning for many diseases, and many became leaders. But I'm going to call on, next slide, please. I'm going to call on Ron Wharton, Scientific Director Emeritus of the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute, and who was at Sick Kids at that time, to tell us the story.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Ron Wharton, and I'm here to pay tribute to Lou Siminovitch for his 15 years of outstanding service as geneticist in chief at the Hospital for Sick Children, now more commonly known as Sick Kids. When Lou was recruited to that position in 1970, he proposed that it was time to apply the knowledge gleaned from molecular genetic studies of bacteria to the study of human genetics. To that end, Lou did not follow the usual practice of recruiting traditional human geneticists, but instead he recruited young people from outside the discipline who brought a fresh approach. He first recruited Manuel Buchwald, a postdoctoral fellow in his lab, who proposed to work on cystic fibrosis, even though he and Lou knew little about the disease. Then he hired me to investigate chromosome abnormalities in children and paid for my crash course at the Yale University Chromosome Lab. Roy Gravel and Rod McGinnis were next and brought expertise in cell biology and metabolic genetics. Later, Diane Cox joined the department in a transfer from pediatrics. All of us were naive about molecular biology and had a desperate need for a new technology to study human genes. That came in 1975 when recombinant DNA technology allowed segments of human DNA to be replicated to millions of copies within a bacterial genome and then cut out for detailed study. This process of gene cloning suddenly made it possible to think about isolating human disease genes to determine their role in the disease process. Lou attended the famous Asilomar conference that explored the risk and promise of this new technology, and he returned to Sick Kids to tell all of us to plan for a career change with gene cloning at center stage. To make it happen, he encouraged us to shed existing research and retrain in recombinant DNA technology. With Lou's encouragement, or sometimes his insistence, Diane Cox and I both took the famous Cold Spring Harbor cloning course, and Rod McGinnis and I both took a sabbatical, me to initiate a project on Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and Rod to study genes directing eye development. Roy Gravel, in the meantime, taught himself the new technology and joined forces with Sandy Loudon at Sick Kids, who had been screening the Ashkenazi Jewish population for carriers of Tay-Sachs disease. And Roy's goal was to clone the Tay-Sachs gene. Manuel Buchwald, with postdoctoral fellow Lapchi Choi providing DNA technology, started a project to map and clone the cystic fibrosis gene. By 1986, my lab, in collaboration with Peter Ray, recruited from Lou's lab, identified the muscular dystrophy gene and showed that it encoded a large structural protein that was absent from the muscle of boys with the disease. The following year, Gravel's lab successfully cloned and characterized the Tay-Sachs gene, working back from the known protein sequence. By 1985, Lou had hired Labchi to a faculty position, and that year, his lab reported mapping the CF gene to chromosome 7. Just 4 years later, in collaboration with Francis Collins and Jack Reardon, they identified the CF gene and showed that it encoded a chloride channel defective in affected children. 2 years after that, in 1991, the Cox lab cloned the gene for Wilson's disease, characterized by copper overload, and showed that it encoded a copper transport protein, while the Buchwald lab cloned several genes responsible for Fanconi anemia and showed that they encoded proteins required for DNA repair. And Rod McGuinness, by that time, had developed a highly productive program to identify genes involved in eye development and retinal disease. This small group of scientists clustered on 2 floors of the Elm Street wing were seen at the time as outperforming famous hospitals and universities around the globe. No other group had cloned so many important disease genes, and without doubt, it was Lou Siminovitch who started the process, and for the first few years, he guided the way and greased the wheels. And Lou did something else. He fostered leadership skills. Of those named above, Gravel went on to be Director of Research at Montreal Children's Hospital, Cox to be Chair of Genetics at the University of Alberta, Buchwald to be Chief of Research at Sick Kids, Wharton to be Scientific Director of the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute, and McGuinness to be Director of Research at the Lady Davis Research Institute at McGill. Nationally, Wharton was the founding Scientific Director of Canada's Stem Cell Network, and McGuinness was Scientific Director of the CIHR Institute of Genetics, and later Acting President of CIHR. Internationally, both Wharton and McGuinness served as President of the American Society of Human Genetics, and Choi went on to be President of the University of Hong Kong. Siminovitch, Choi, and Wharton are Gairdner awardees and laureates of the Canadian Medical Hall of Fame. It is quite an amazing story, thanks to Lou and his insistence on scientific excellence and, in our case, clinical relevance. We salute you, Lou, and wish you well in your 100th year of life.
Thank you, Ron, for that excellent presentation. We'll move back to the slides for a second. So we move on to the LUNENFELD-TANENBAUM Research Institute. In 1984, the leadership of Mount Sinai Hospital, involving people like Irving Gerstein, Sidney Liswood, Gary Turner, Joe Mappa, realized that MSH was not a research hospital. Lou says the total research income from peer-reviewed grants was $50,000. And so a major research institute was proposed by the board. Lou's advice was sought, so he would come over from across the street from Sick Kids and start helping to plan what the institute might be, and also to advise on who the leadership should be. But the administration at Sinai soon thought this through and said, Lou, you must be the director. And Lou, after some persuasion, agreed, and he started totally from scratch. A major donation of over $7 million came in from the LUNENFELD family, and later a major advisor and donor was Larry Tannenbaum. So Lou began in 1985 with 6 divisions that he was going to focus on with the people he was going to recruit: developmental biology, cancer, immunology, bone disease, and epidemiology and clinical studies. Lou was very specific in the operational parameters for recruitment. Recruitees should be able to get salary awards in competition, get peer-reviewed grants not only in Canada but and abroad, be able to attract excellent students and postdocs, and so on. No tenure was promised. So we have initial recruits like Alan Bernstein and Tony Pawson and Janet Rawson and so on. Fair enough to say that during his 10 years of leadership, Lou established the Research Institute as arguably the most preeminent in Canada, and many feel that it was his greatest magnum opus in Toronto. Next slide, please. I'm going to invite Jim Woodgett, the Director of Research at LUNENFELD-TANENBAUM, to carry this much further. Jim.
Thank you, John. So at almost 65 years of age, Lou actually held two jobs for almost a year at SickKids and then as the inaugural research director at Mount Sinai Hospital's Research Institute. Here, if you can have the next slide, please. He was not only able to build a new institute from scratch, but also to carve out the design of the new labs. As you can see here in 1984, this was a true framework for Lou to build his dream research institute. And indeed, he distilled his many experiences from his prior leadership roles into what he thought would be the optimal delivery mechanism for the very best research. And this cumulative vision really must have been rather good, because the LUNENFELD, as John mentioned, enjoys a lasting legacy of success, and still retains its focus on discovery science and, of course, excellence. And it's a really important lesson. If you get the DNA of an organism right from the get-go, and you can control the mutation rate, then you're set for life. Lou then decorated this genome with a repertoire of scientists recruited from across Canada and elsewhere. And if you have the next slide, please. In fact, some of those, as shown here, some of these scientists that he recruited are still at the LUNENFELD: Andras, Irene, Joe, and Jim Dennis. And I think, again, this indicates the importance that Lou put around the people. And of course, there are some which went on to better things: Janet Wassant, Alex Joyner, Alan Bernstein, and many others. So these scientists have over the past 35 years or so now, 40 years, have gone on to pave the way for exciting new developments in cellular signal transduction, in proteomics, in stem cell biology, mouse models of human disease. I can go on and on. At the time, though, Lou was also ruffling feathers, which he has had a tendency to do throughout his career. At one point, he recruited 3 young stars from Queen's University, Bob Kerbel, Jim Dennis, and John Roeder. And I think Kingston is probably still a forbidden city for him to return to. One thing that Lou wasn't known for was his sartorial elegance. Go to the next slide, please. And this is, you've actually seen this before at the beginning. This is one, I think, of the rarest photographs of Lou wearing a tie and indeed a suit. And I think either Lou has an allergy to ties, or probably more likely, it constricts his ability to tell people what to do. He's always got something to say. But for his lack of sartorial elegance, if we could just click again on the slide, you'll see that there was an optical influence on at least some of the scientists at the LUNENFELD. There's some uniform here in terms of their glassware. So Lou was also, I think, one of his key learnings was that you don't judge people from their looks, you judge them from their brains and also their heart. And the two together are really important for learning who's going to be making an impact in the world going forward. Lou also recognized the importance of the hospital leadership. This obviously had happened at OCI and at SickKids and at Sinai as well. And he worked very hard with the leadership of the hospital, chairs of the board such as Irving Gerstein, Jerry Turner, and CEOs such as Joe Mapper, and especially working with Larry Tannenbaum, who's chair of the research committee at the time and is still chair of the research committee. Larry is quite an amazing philanthropist and supporter of science, not only in Toronto, but in Canada. Lou's influence at Sinai was also larger than the Research Institute. It really helped raise the bar for excellence not only in research, but also in the clinical areas. And we can see that today because all of the clinical chiefs at Mount Sinai Hospital, and indeed the CEO, Gary Newton, have research experience. And that, I think, it says a lot about Lou's impact here. And in fact, his impact has been so immense that in a couple of years' time, in 2023, when Mount Sinai Hospital celebrates its 100th birthday, it'll be named, one of the chairs is going to be launched, is the Lou Siminovitch Sinai 100 chair. Now, of course, we've all talked about the highlights and of Lou's career, and with leadership, you also have some lows. And I want to just mention one person, Tony Pawson. I have the next slide, please, who was a confidant and a friend, both of Lou and myself, and a true genius. And this is Tony actually being awarded the 2008 Kyoto Prize, and we lost Tony in 2013. But I'll just end this with a couple of personal reflections. The Lou Siminovitch that most people see is the scientist and the, if you like, the scientific entrepreneur. And he's been called the father of genetics in Canada, quite rightly so. But he's also a very deeply personal man. He, my wife and I enjoyed many dinners, usually as a prelude to a concert at the TSO. And at those dinners, he would present a list. And those of you who know him will probably have seen this list as well. And there's a list of some ideas, a mixture of advice and some complaints, of course. And also he used to write long, long letters. He was genuinely interested and is genuinely interested in people and in your family. And he wants to know about family developments. He's a true developmental biologist. And I'll end by saying, what are Lou's rules, the Lou rules? And they are always to look forward, to seek out leaders of the next generation, to always to mentor people, to encourage them, to never stand still, to state your mind, and if you don't want to do that, then just shut up and get out of the way, and to celebrate excellence wherever you see it. Thank you, Lou. Over to you, John.
I'm just going to have a word about Lou's publications, and he's very modest about it. He actually feels that there are only 4 papers among his 200 that were truly transformative. We've mentioned the Eureka moment of the lysogeny project in Paris, then the growing the animal cells in suspension at CONNAUGHT, technology of chromosomes, karyotyping, and opening the field of somatic genetics. He had many foci, including the hematopoietic cells that I mentioned before, lambdophages, cancer, as well as some other things. But then he moved into the swing of, as Jim mentioned, many elder statesman articles, where science was going here in town and in Canada, and what were our shortcomings on the scientific scene. He was relentless. He made some 30 university lectures, all relating to the state of science. He had a major influence. He wasn't afraid to say what he thought. Next slide. So if we look at Toronto, Lou and the University of Toronto Academic Health Science Centre focus on the middle, the UT, whatever you want to call the faculty, the complex of health sciences centered around university and college and beyond. And we go to the left, where we have the asterisks and the straight line, where there's substantial influence by Lou, the CONNAUGHT laboratories, OCI at PMH, genetics, immunology, biophysics at MSB, genetics at Sick Kids, the LUNENFELD-TANENBAUM Research Institute at Mount Sinai, the Rotman Research Institute at Baycrest, frequent linkages to Simcoe Hall for the CONNAUGHT fund for various search committees, you name it. Then indirectly, all the hospitals want to develop research institutes, Sunnybrook Health Science Center, St. Michael's, I should have Women's College on there, and now indirectly with Mars. This is what as I have a quote down below, as it was said of Christopher Wren in the 1660s, who was one of the founders of the Royal Society and was the architect of 53 churches in London, including St. Paul's, when his monument said, if you are searching for the impact of Christopher Wren, look around you. And in Toronto, this could be applied to Lou at the University of Toronto Health Sciences Complex. Next slide, please. So what about Lou, the person and the leader? What observations could be made? Next slide. In my going back and forth with Lou at visits many years, I always hear certain people mentioned. For example, in the business field, Joe Rotman, who we work very closely with for the Rotman Research Institute. They didn't know each other at the time, and then they developed a 25-year relationship of working together. Harry Rosen came as a friend. Jim mentioned Lou with a tie, but in later years, Harry made very significant and Herculean efforts to improve Lou's sartorial elegance. He had to admit he didn't succeed, but he liked the lunches and the list that, as Jim mentioned, that made up the discussion point. Larry Tannenbaum, who tried to actually inculcate also interest in sports in Lou, not too successful, but he was very successful in friendship and promoting research. Peter Lougheed, who twice tried to lure Lou to come over to Alberta to head the Heritage Funds, but it was vetoed in the family. But he was impressed that a premier of a province would try to use income derived from the oil industry and take the initiative to develop medical science in that province. And he was a member of their advisory body for a long time. Then in Toronto, we have John Evans with the McMaster Medical School, the president of the University of Toronto, Elilix, Global Health, World Bank, CFI, and Mars. He viewed him, they had a very close relationship. He was particularly impressed by the intellect of Fraser Mustard, not only in his research on thrombosis, but he as the founding president of CFAR. In fact, Lou was in a small nucleus that set out the founding of the CFAR, which then developed these marvelous networks in current cutting-edge research in many fields. He was close to George Connell, president of U of T, who had also been the associate dean of research at the University of Toronto before going to Western. He admired Jacques Chenet, who without question developed medical sciences at a level which was not present there in Quebec, and founded one of the first research institutes in Canada, the CRIM, the Clinical Research Institute in Montreal. He's very close to Bob Salter, a tremendous gentleman, a tremendous character, a great orthopedic innovative surgeon, and who did his research on passive motion. Then at the bottom, you have Malcolm Brown, who really set the stage and the sort of foundations for the Medical Research Council and its successive iterations thereafter, and also that translated further into way Henry Friesen created the CIHR. And Cal Steller, starting maybe perhaps early on, but particularly in the 90s and beyond, they were very close on various commercial developments, and we'll have more to say about that later. And then we have Charles Hollenberg, who came in the early 70s and changed a department which was very traditional into a modern Department of Medicine, like was the model in outstanding medical schools in North America. Jack Laidlaw, who started the Institute of Medical Science and was also the leader of the Gundy Report in the late 70s, when a number of key people gathered from all Canada to say, we're not moving along in Canada in research. And then I have Gary Goldenberg, who's Lou's friend, and he became my friend through Lou, who has been such a great philanthropist and supporter, as he's of this gathering tonight.
and continues to be that. Next slide. Lou had many prominent international friends. Some of them came through Gardner and through earlier experience. Sidney Brenner was a great help to Lou in the 80s. He was on the Gardner Medical Advisory Board for about 15 years. And we had those great dinners on Monday evening after the adjudication committee met. And Sidney Brenner would have always a great agenda. And these were great discussions of science. Joe Goldstein of Southwestern Medical School in Dallas, he with Michael Brown discovered the LDL receptor and changed the treatment of hypercholesterolemia. Great friend David Baltimore, virologist, immunologist, and they discovered reverse transcriptase with some others. Oliver Smithies had been here in the 50s, who then made his discoveries, led to our knockouts and gene targeting. Mel Cohen, immunologist at Salk Institute, and Canada, as I called him, came from Manchester, but UBC's site-specific mutagenesis discoverer, a Nobel laureate in '93 in chemistry. These are part of the crowd that Lou moved in. Next slide. And the scientists he talked about are some of the ones we've already heard of today. Gordon Whitmer from the OCI ever on, Bob Phillips, Jim Friesen, we'll hear more later, Ron Wharton, Rod McGuinness, Harry Schachter, Alec McKenzie at CHIO. He was very proud of Dunstutz because when they started to form the Rotman Research Institute at Baycrest, working in partnership with Rotman, who had a plan based on his committee, Luda told him to just discard it totally and start over. They should first find a leader, and they persuaded Don Stutz, reluctant to come to Toronto, and that's been a great success and has led to so many advancements in cognitive science. Michel Noble and Connaughט from the government of Ontario, where they worked together, and we'll hear more about that momentarily. Next slide. And there were Jack Goldie and Brian Underdown, first here and then at McMaster, Mark Poznansky at the Robarts, and then here at OGI. I had the privilege to work with them through Gardner and initially in MRC way back in the late 70s and 80s. We just heard Jim Goodwood, and we're going to hear later from our recent president, David Naylor. Next slide. But Lou also brought up people who just started science, and some of them was just mentioned by Jim, Irina Androulis, Alex Choyner and Lapchi Choi, but also Pam Stanley, Rosanna Wexford, and Peter Lindsley. So the people influence and those that he remembers and talks about is very large. He's grateful to them all, and they're grateful to him. Next slide, please. If you look at a snapshot of the institutions that Lou was involved with and helped shape in terms of their ethos and their daily operations, it's just huge. If we start at the top from the left, Ontario, earlier iterations of Council of Health, Mental Health, Genetics, the Challenge Fund, in Ottawa, MRC and the Science Council. Bob Phillips talked about the National Cancer Institute, where Lou was there through every iteration, all the way through the president. The research institutes here and the ones outside Toronto, like the MNI and CRIM in Montreal, the Loeb in Ottawa, and more recently he was still making trips to Thunder Bay. I think that's just stopped about a year ago. Canadian universities and some American universities on your far right at the bottom. Lots of commercialization, connections with the US, NIH, Howard Hughes, various societies from the Royal Societies of Canada and elsewhere, and then United Church for Ethics, charitable organizations, arthritis, Huntington's, ovarian cancer, then the Gardner Prize and Killam, and a whole set of journals. It's huge undertaking and huge influence. I don't know where he found all the time. Next slide. So now we're going to discuss Lou's influence on the wider Ontario world and perhaps a bit of the Canadian world.
and I've invited Ken Knox, Emeritus Deputy Minister of Energy, Science and Technology, to take that away. Ken.
Thank you very much, John, for the opportunity to participate in this incredibly important event as we record some of the activities that Lou Siminovitch did throughout his life, but in my case, it's within a very small or short snapshot of his long, distinguished career. My role with Lou started in 1997. He was 78 years old, and in his own book that he wrote, he starts off in the preface by mentioning, memory is tricky. So you're getting my memory of the activities that Grandfather Siminovitch and I participated in for about 12 years. And the focus of my presentation is on how he interacted and influenced the outcome from government financial sources. I was introduced to Lou by Calvin Stiller. We had a program that Cal was chair of, and I was a deputy minister in the Ministry of Energy, Science and Technology, and responsible for the delivery of the Ontario Research and Development Challenge Fund. It was a significant program, $500 million over 10 years, and the magic in that program was that it needed to be matched by the province of Ontario's funding, business, that is industry, and the universities had to reorganize their priorities to put in a third of the money that would go to the scientists. All included then, that's a $1.5 billion investment in science in the province of Ontario. Cal introduced me to Lou because we needed advisory panels that understood the science of the applications that were coming before us. And Lou chaired the life science panel. 55% of the money of that program went into the life science portfolio. I quickly became one of the folks that respected and depended on Lou for advice, counsel, and the right answer to many of the questions that we needed to ask. I became a disciple, along with many others, of the Siminovitch way of thinking. Soon into our program of delivery, we realized that two things were going to cause us to fall short in that program. One of them was that the federal government had created a program for infrastructure called the Canadian Foundation for Innovation. They had significant funding in that, and the provinces needed to match it. It fell to us to do so. And we realized that capital would take a lot of the $50 million a year that we had to invest, and we wouldn't be able to help scientists on the operating side. Lou helped convince not only me, but the policymakers in government that we needed to create a separate program and fund. And to our advantage, perhaps a bad public policy decision, the selling of Highway 407, allowed the finances of the province for a short period of time to put some money in the Ontario Innovation Trust. And Lou continued to be an advisor to that program for several years. The other major hiccup that we found in the delivery of the Ontario Research and Development Challenge Fund was that there was a new scientific area which was requiring a lot of funding, and that was the area, unbeknownst to many, called genomics. 1997, 1998, come 1999, Lou created a group, and this was really too much fun. He said to the Challenge Fund board, we need to bring all the genomics and genetic scientists together in one room and talk about the future of genetics and then genomics. And I want Ken Knox, who was the deputy minister at the time, to co-chair the meeting. Of course, Lou knew that I didn't understand genetics at all, but what he wanted to ensure was that government was in the room to hear these scientists make their pitch. And indeed I was. And I became enthralled and enthusiastic about the opportunity that genetics and genomics would create for not just Canada, but the world. Out of that endeavor, the province was convinced to invest in something called the Ontario Genomics Institute. Shortly after we got it established with two pillars. One was platforms where the scientists would share resources and get rid of some of the rivalry among universities who love to compete, and also spires where the scientists within university institutions would be able to compete and create areas of deep focus. After we got that rolling, it was Lou's idea that what we should be doing was something at the national level. Now, he didn't go to Ottawa. He sent Cal Stiller and Ken Knox, and I think John Evans. This is where my memory's a bit sketchy, and of course our dear friend John isn't here to check with. And we were sent to Ottawa to meet with then Kevin Lynch, who was the Deputy Minister of Industry Canada at the time, became Secretary to the Privy Council, was heavily involved in budgeting and Deputy of Finance at one point. And they created in Ottawa Genome Canada. Genome Canada, and through its matching funds, have created $3.9 billion in scientific endeavor across Canada since its inception. I could trace that back to Lou Siminovitch's magic of not going to Ottawa, but influencing Ottawa through others to get the job done. Now, Lou did not become a fan, nor did I, of the administrative burden that Genome Canada put forward. Sometimes when you ask for things, you don't quite get what you asked for. We got the program, we got significant funding, but what we also got was a bureaucratic burden that continues to plague scientists to this day as they fight for the scarce resources that are available for genomics. A lot of money that I've talked about here. The Challenge Fund, huge money. Ontario Innovation Trust, huge money. Matching CFI, huge money. Genome Canada, $3.9 billion in that program alone. What I think, though, was Lou's special gift to me was the introduction to young scientists. He used to call them hard rocks. He probably still does this in his 100th year. In his 101st year, I stand corrected. And that was introducing me to young scientists who needed a lift up as they started their careers. Heather Monroe Bloom did the same thing. And through that initiative and his instigation, we created a program called the Premier's Research Excellence Awards Program. We all knew that every year a finance minister and the minister responsible for science needed a shiny new penny. Now, sometimes the shiny new penny was polishing off an old one. Sometimes it was taking the material in the penny and remolding it into something else, but sometimes it was absolutely new. And the Premier's Research Excellence Program, along with the Genome Initiative, was absolutely new. And it was a program to help young scientists on their way by allowing them to get their research done faster. $75 million was invested in that program, and a lot of emphasis put on science by the Premier of the day and by the ministers responsible for going to various events to introduce this program to scientists. Lou was the instigator of that, and his influence to all of the people around the world of introducing and giving a hand to all the young scientists have rewarded all of us jointly and in a way that can't be explained in words. And I thank you very much, John, for the opportunity to do this short presentation to say thank you to my dear friend and grandfather, Lou Siminovitch. Bye for now.
Ken, thank you so much for relating your wonderful experiences with Lou, with government in Ontario and Ottawa. Another person who worked very closely together with Lou on commercial ventures was Cal Stiller, where Lou and Cal spent considerable time on the Canadian Medical Discovery Fund, working with a lot of investment sources. And Cal has summarized his experience with Lou as follows. Lou has been the most listened to voice of science in Canada for the past half century. And during that time, he's had no tolerance for compromise or excellence. He literally snorts when he observes mediocrity, particularly when it is paired with ignorance or sloth. You know that Lou respected you when you became the object of his criticism. I used to receive weekly 2 lists. One that listed the things I was doing that I should be, that I wasn't doing that I should be, and when listening those things that were wasting my time and interest, he became one of my closest advisors and a personal friend. I love Lou like a father and have known him for over 50 years. The first 25 years I admired and feared him, and the past 25 years I have loved him and still fear him. He remains, after a full century, the best living example of uncompromising excellence. In matters of science, Lou has the blink gene that Gladwell wrote about. He sees excellence in science intuitively, and he senses bogus ideas in a blink. Let's move on to prominent awards to Lou Siminovitch. And I'm going to just list a few of the important ones among the many he has received during his lifetime. He became a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1965, a university professor of the University of Toronto in 1976, a Fellow of the Royal Society in London, the FRS, in 1980. He received the Canada Gairdner-Whitman Award in 1981. He became a Companion of the Order of Canada in 1989. He was inducted into the Canadian Medical Hall of Fame in 1997. He was elected Foreign Associate of the National Academy of Science in 1999. He was honored with the Eleanor and Lou Siminovitch Prize in Theatre in their memories in 2001. He received the Order of Ontario in 2007. You can see below the Honorary Doctor of Science degrees that he's received from 8 Canadian universities. I want to pause for a moment and talk about Lou and the Canada Gairdner Awards. In 1976, the great Charles Hollenberg, who was president of the Gairdner Foundation, established the Canada Gairdner-Whitman Award. This was an award for a medical scientist who had been exceptionally brilliant and successful in developing medical science in Canada. And Lou was obviously a natural person for this. And the citation in 1981 reads, "For unique contributions to Canadian medicine as a geneticist, as a wise and effective advisor to government in the area of science policy, and a leader of the Canadian academic community." Thereafter, Lou was a member of the Medical Advisory Board for about 10 years. This is the board that serves as the major adjudication committee that selects the annual international awards and the others as well. And this, of course, led to selection of many of the leading world scientists who later also received the Nobel Prize. From 1990 on, he was a personal advisor to me and a friend and a regular attendee at the Gairdner Gala celebrating the laureates. The pictures you see below recall the 2009 Gairdner International Awards. At these awards, approximately 70 Gairdner Awards returned to Toronto to celebrate the 50th anniversary, and among them were 24 Nobel Prize winners. On the right, you see Lou at the table with his friends that evening. Now, in looking over the files of Lou for various prizes, various nominations, I thought I would pick one to show you the kind of advocacy that took place, the kind of respect by fellow colleagues across Canada and elsewhere who nominated him. And this is from the 1994 nomination of the Lou Siminovitch to the Canadian Medical Hall of Fame. Ford Doolittle of Dalhousie in Halifax wrote, "Lou has been an excellent advisor, interfering only when necessary, but always giving an honest and well-thought opinion. I have come to rely on his judgment quite deeply and to share even more strongly his vision of the importance of basic research in Canada." James Friesen in Toronto wrote, "It is not an exaggeration to say that Lou Siminovitch is the most important reason for the overall success of medical research in Canada." Phil Gold of Montreal wrote, "Unlike scientists both in Canada and elsewhere, Lou's science will not die with him because of his ideas and offspring
who will continue to carry forward his work and concept. Next. Alan Bernstein and Tony Pawson of Toronto wrote, "Biomedical research in Canada owes an enormous debt to this remarkable individual. It is probably not hyperbole to say that Lou has done more to change the landscape of Canadian biomedical research than any other single Canadian." The famed John Evans wrote, "An array of efforts in research and its advocacy have made him the visionary founder and prime statesman of medical research in Canada." And the beloved and Robert Salter wrote, "Dr. Siminovitch is without question Canada's most renowned medical scientist and medical builder. In 1997, Lou was inducted into the Canadian Medical Hall of Fame." Next. Last evening, Henry Friesen called me from Winnipeg and expressed, again, congratulations on Lou's 100th birthday and his 101st year. Henry, as you know, is the Emeritus President of the Medical Research Council and was the creator of the current CIHR. This is what Henry says: "We can only stand in awe of the profound influence you have had, inspiring so many young scientists, building and developing major scientific institutions, and offering decision makers wise counsel on enriching the funding of research and cultivating a more robust science culture in Canada. And looking ahead," he says, "we should do well to heed your prescient words offered a few years ago that express your philosophy. Namely, science is increasingly driven by advances in technology, but is always in the end dependent on addressing big ideas, both activities pursued with an unwavering commitment to excellence." Thank you, Lou, for a lifetime both of big ideas and a sustained commitment to excellence. Canada is the beneficiary of all that you've championed and achieved. Henry, that was well said. Next. Some characteristics of Lou. It's time to chat how we perceive Lou. What's been written about him? So here are some words. Lou, the tower of scientific excellence in Canada. Lou, the strong family man. He's extremely dedicated to his family. Lou and recruitment. He loves committees of one. Lou, the great mentor. Lou, the great visionary. Lou, the Darth Vader. Lou, the shit disturber. Lou, the wise career advisor and confidant. Lou, the incognitive politician who gets into government office and leading people. Lou, the writer of letters, as John Evans used to say, lots and lots of letters. Lou as an inspiration. Lou, who truly is a caller of a spade is a spade. He deals with things realistically. Lou, the agnostic, the atheist, but a friend of believers. Next, please. When you visit Lou, or have heard him before, he often repeats well-known sayings, and I've chosen 4 of them. He may say of a scientist, his or her value is 10 to the minus 5. Frequently, when he's discussing someone, he will say, "Do you know the difference between a phenotype and a genotype?" Or he may say, she had no ideas. It's comforting though when he says, "You are on my chromosome." And there's more, but these will do for today. The Siminovitch family. Lou is extremely loyal to his family. And one of these things he asks of all visitors, "How is your family?" But let's have a word about Lou's family. So at the top of the left, you see Lou and his wife Eleanor at their wedding dinner. The beautiful Eleanor and the very handsome, sartorially well-dressed Lou. Then at the top in the middle are the 3 young daughters, I believe during their time in Paris, and on the far right, early in Toronto, Eleanor and Lou with Coco, Kathy, and Margot. And the colored slide at the bottom are is Lou and all the three daughters with their spouses and the grandchildren. And then I'm going to ask Dr. Kathy Siminovitch, next please, to comment on the family.
I am often asked if there are identifiable qualities that foretell achievement in science. Typical responses that I've heard include such attributes as intellect, drive, or creativity. But these responses are generic and too simplistic. These individual qualities may determine whether one can succeed, but they do not determine whether one will succeed. Success, whether in science or any major walk of human endeavor, is not so easily distilled into disembodied single attributes or merely traced to the genetic cards we're dealt. We are all shaped by our individual histories. Our thinking and ultimately achievements are profoundly influenced by those who have supported, inspired, and sometimes to our discomfort, challenged us. I've been inspired by some extraordinary individuals, but the two most powerful influences in my life have been my parents, Eleanor and Lou. And although this session tonight is dedicated to my father, it's impossible for me to separate these two in terms of their influence on me. So my remarks are about and dedicated to both my parents. My phenotype, not just my genotype, reflects being raised by parents who lived by the credo that whatever one achieved in life, passion and joy in what one does is more important than any other measure of success. My parents lived through the Depression and World War II and then spent 6 years in what proved to be a cultural and scientific mecca of post-war France. They emerged from these experiences with an intense appetite for intellectual pursuit and social change. Although both were raised in the style of caring but benign neglect, my parents were deeply devoted to inculcating their three daughters with their own delight in the cultural, scientific, and political world surrounding us, not by any formal strategy, but rather by the ambience they created. And so, in our home, family mealtime discussions rarely focused on school events or social interactions. Instead, reflecting that my mother was a playwright and voracious reader, we traded opinions on the latest production of Brecht's Mother Courage, Chekhov's Three Sisters, or more contemporary works, such as Stoppard's Travesties, all my mother's personal favorites. We enthusiastically debated the messages of Sartre's Huis Clos, Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, and Heller's Catch-22. Our home had no tchotchkes. Instead, the living room, den, every bedroom was jam-packed with books. Our family time together, in the car, or at our favorite family restaurant, Coleman's Delicatessen, anywhere, was dominated by vibrant discussions of characters, writers, and ideas. My sisters and I were also immersed in our parents' vision of social responsibility and wonder at the progress of science. Our family doctrines included atheism and socialism with a taste of communism. And so our vocabulary was peppered by genotypes and phenotypes, Sacco and Vendetti, and McCarthyism mixed in with hematopoiesis and transfection. My parents taught their girls to question everything, passing on to us, perhaps unwittingly, an inherent distrust of authority and a political incorrectness which has since plagued my working life. Eleanor and Lou loved knowledge, and the gamut of their interest was enormous. As a playwright and scientist, respectively, my mother and father also shared with us the intricacies of their occupations, never described as work per se, but rather as part of the continuum of their intellectual life. I still hear my late mother's voice radiating with joy as she described and sought our input on a new character she created. And I will never forget my father's reverence and excitement as he delighted in various successes in his or other laboratories. My parents derived such pleasure from their work. They lived by the Pavlovian edict to be passionate in one's work and in one's searchings. They intricately wove their occupations into the fabric of our lives, that it is impossible for me, in my memory, to separate their work lives from them. I had a Renaissance childhood. I was so very lucky in choosing Lou and Eleanor to be my parents, in growing up in what seemed like an ordinary, but what I later recognized to be extraordinary world they created, and learning so vividly from them That is the voyage, as much as its end, that needs to be savored.
I want to speak further about Lou and culture. Lou the Outlier, A Life of Science and Culture. He summarizes his interests as follows. With the seminal stimulus from Eleanor, I have been able to enjoy considerable time with my family, especially on weekends and in the summer, as well as the enjoyment of a broad spectrum of extracurricular reading. Again, with Eleanor's special influence, I have derived considerable satisfaction in enjoying the full gamut of the arts and humanities, theater, music, art, opera and ballet, as well as literature, especially Russian, French, and American. The list is long, including sorties essentially every Friday evening to all of the above in Toronto, plus several trips to New York, theater weeks with Eleanor at London, Stratford, Tanglewood, Shaw, elsewhere to the United States, several trips in Canada, to the UK, and much of Europe, China, Japan, and Mexico, with and without children, and more recently with my 2 elder grandchildren. Last December, I was in Chicago and Florida, even at my age. In fact, I do not wish to exaggerate, but I claim to be an outlier in respect to the views of C.P. Snow's description of the lack of communication between the 2 cultures, arts, humanities, and the sciences. Yes, Lou, you've brought them together, and we appreciate what you said. Canada has been good to me. Let's discuss the Eleanor and Lou Siminovitch Prize for Theatre. 2 decades ago, a group of 10 donors met and started the Eleanor and Lou Siminovitch Prize for Theatre to have a special honor for them both. They were helped by the Bank of Montreal at that time, and the prize was defined as follows. The Siminovitch Prize was inspired by love and respect for Lou and Eleanor Siminovitch, honoring Lou's contributions as a scientist and architect of Canadian science, Eleanor's creativity as a playwright, and their mutual lifelong love for theater. The prize was designed to catapult exceptionally talented artists to new levels of innovation. So the prize was begun for the next decade. Slide next, please. When a new group came in to develop the foundation of the Eleanor and Lou Siminovitch Prize, and this is now an ongoing new board of directors that have continued to put the funding together. So what the prize accomplishes is it provides $75,000 to a mid-career Canadian theatre maker of great distinction, and $25,000 to a protege of his or her selection at the same time. This annually awarded prize beautifully reflects Lou and Eleanor's passion for discovery, for ideas and imagination, the quest to ask and answer questions that drives greatness, both in theater and in science. The Siminovitch Prize also honors their love of mentoring and elevating the careers and creative aspirations of others. In the words of the laureates, the Siminovitch Prize has proven to be life and career changing, setting it as a springboard for brilliant theater makers from across this country, allowing them to create and share stories that inspire and illuminate the human experience. The Eleanor and Lou Siminovitch Prize for Theatre has become, without doubt, the leading prize of its kind in Canada and is much vied for by the artistic community. If you want to honor Lou, you can consider making a contribution. And next Thursday, November 26th, the 2020 prize winners will be announced. I now want to speak about those who've been associated with Lou and culture in the more recent years. And the This will, I want to mention, as when Jim Woodgood already mentioned, that he and his wife often took Lou to the TSO and other concerts, and that Harry and Judy Schachter have done the same. But a special friend was Jim and Lynn Friesen. They've been friends for 60 years with Lou, and it's been a time filled with shared love of music and theater. Jim Friesen, as you know, is an emeritus professor at the University of Toronto, and the picture on the right shows Lynn with Lou. Lynn, regrettably, has had a stroke about a month ago, and she is in the process of recovering. Jim was not able to be with us tonight, and Kathy Siminovitch will read the remarks that Jim has composed in honor of Lou.
Good evening. I'm Kathy Siminovitch, and it's my pleasure to read this tribute written for my father by Dr. Jim Friesen, who became, in 1959, my father's very first graduate student. So these are Jim's words. By his own telling, Lou's boyhood home in Montreal was not a cultural hotbed. No books, no records. Meeting and then marrying Eleanor changed that. Eleanor was the cultural complement of Lou, well-read, with an appreciation of music, a playwright, adept with foreign languages, and having not the slightest interest in science. She became Lou's cultural tutor. Eleanor eased Lou into classical music by introducing him to Tchaikovsky, an ideal choice of soaring melodies and rich orchestral tones. When they moved to Paris in 1946, Eleanor widened Lou's cultural instruction to theater, including Hamlet and French. Lou was an eager student of the arts. Skip over a few decades to Lou's later years in Toronto. The Eleanor and Lou Siminovitch Prize in Theater is the most prestigious of its kind in Canada. It emphasizes the couple's interest in theater, and particularly Lou's complete conversion to a cultural hound. Musically, Lou attended concerts of symphony with the Woodgets, chamber music with the Schachters, and plays and concerts with Lynn and me. By this time, it was obvious that Lou had not only absorbed Eleanor's cultural tutoring, but he had refined and made it his own. He prefers Beethoven, Mozart, and Bach. He enjoys large concerts in Roy Thompson Hall, but is really in his element in smaller settings, Tafel Music and Kerner Hall. In the later years, both Lou, Lynn, and Lynn needed to use walkers to get around. Many is the concert in Kerner Hall where I, as designated cat herder, saw my two charges rushing off at top senior speed in opposite directions, each convinced that they alone knew where our seats were and how to get there. We always managed to get seats at the front of Kerner Hall, the better for well-used eyes and ears to appreciate the concerts. In recent years, Lou's musical tastes have become more and more focused. He still appreciates Beethoven, mostly because he sees Beethoven as a supreme example of the human mind's originality. How could Beethoven come up with 50 completely new musical ideas? How could his brain do that? Asked Lou. But Lou's highest musical pedestal is reserved for Bach. He could listen to Bach forever, but best of all for him is the Goldberg Variations and the Brandenburg Concertos. The last concert we wanted to go to, but was canceled because of the pandemic, was to be a string orchestra version of the Goldberg Variations. Lou loves theater, opera, and ballet. His regular visits with Kathy and Margot to New York are highlights. Locally, Lou, Lynn, and I went to plays in Toronto, Stratford, and Niagara-on-the-Lake. Then always packed a picnic lunch for the day of the Shaw Festival. Lou loved eating on the grass under the trees on the cliff shore above Lake Ontario. As with music, Lou's theater tastes have become more refined with time. In the end, his favorite is Shakespeare. And in Shakespeare, Lear and Hamlet for Lou are the peak. He said that has seen these at least 10 different productions of Hamlet. Now that Lynn is ill, it'll be hard for Lou, Lynn, and I to attend concerts together. But I hope we find other ways to continue to share our love and our joy of music and each other.
I am still here. If you go to Lou's office at Mount Sinai Hospital or to his apartment or phone him, one of his first remarks is, I am still here. Lou goes to his office most days, and around him he's surrounded by pictures of his family, previous mentors, colleagues, and there's great art such as Picasso and Modigliani and others. He reads voraciously. Every morning the Globe and the Star are opened, the Sudoku and the crossword is done, but he covers the papers extensively. Science and Nature are scattered around, and he follows them and writes to people who should be alert to a new publication. And there are many novels and biographies lying around, and he especially loves science biographies such as those of Sidney Brenner or Francois Jacob. He recalls great days in detail: Paris, the Sinai, sick kids, people like Malcolm Brown, John Evans, Fraser Mustard, and others. But he ceaselessly and always continues to worry where we stand as a nation, as Canada, in terms of achieving the stature of world-class science. He thinks we're not quite there. He values particularly the international institutions that are there and thinks that we should be there. In the words of Robert Frost, and in terms of Canadian science, Lou may say, we have miles to go before we sleep. Lou is looking well, and he's enormously grateful to his family, his caregivers, and especially to Kathy. He's also enormously grateful to Mount Sinai Hospital for their excellent and sustained medical care. It's time to sum up, and we're privileged to have as commentator David Naylor, President Emeritus of the University of Toronto, who's going to speak to us.
It seems fitting that today's event is co-sponsored by the Toronto Medical Historical Club and the Department of Molecular Genetics at the University of Toronto. In honoring Lou Siminovitch, we recognize a truly remarkable individual who has played a pivotal role in the evolving history of medical science, not only here in Toronto, but as previous speakers have emphasized, on a provincial, national, and international scale. And we've heard too that it was Lou Siminovitch who stewarded the transition of the university's Department of Medical Cell Biology into what became the Department of Medical Genetics. Today, it's obvious that the genomics revolution has transformed basic and translational medical science. It underpins the rise of biotechnology and modern immunology. And in this virtual celebration forced upon us by a viral pandemic, let us also acknowledge that these advances have been crucial to ongoing progress in diagnosis, treatment, and prevention of COVID-19. There's no one in this country who saw that potential earlier and more clearly than Lou Siminovitch. And there's also no one who worked more tirelessly to share that vision with leaders in the academic and the healthcare sphere, and no one, as we heard earlier from Ken Knox, who was a more effective advocate with the public service and with political leaders. This outsized influence has unfolded through a career with a staggering number of memorable stages. It is, on one level, a familiar story of how immigrants and their children have repeatedly seized opportunities and lifted our nation. But it's also a case study in how world-class talent blossoms. In Lou's case, much of that early flowering occurred in renowned intellectual hothouses. McGill's Department of Chemistry, the MRC in Ottawa, Chalk River, and of course the Pasteur Institute, where Lou's genius and passion for excellence were nurtured in the company of future Nobel laureates. We did hear from Bob Phillips about Lou's growth as a scientist, as a research leader, and as an advocate for better science policy during those productive years that Lou spent at the Ontario Cancer Institute. And what I'd simply emphasize is that by the time he left OCI at age 49 for new leadership roles at the University of Toronto, Lou Siminovitch had already made major discoveries that forever established his credibility as a world-class scientist. Indeed, 10 years later, when Lou was appointed a Fellow of the Royal Society of London, his scientific biography listed multiple discoveries and observed that Lou's contributions spanned genetics, microbiology, immunology, and developmental biology. Lou's later years in the Medical Sciences Building on campus overlapped partly with his 15 years as founding geneticist-in-chief at the Hospital for Sick Children. Ron Wharton has concisely explained how and why in that Camelot period, the Siminovitch team of scientists and trainees at Sick Kids cloned more important disease genes than all their competitors at famous hospitals and universities worldwide. So the Siminovitch magic at work again. Lou's last major leadership role, of course, was as inaugural director of the Mount Sinai Hospital Research Institute, latterly the LUNENFELD and then the LUNENFELD-TANENBAUM Institute. Jim Woodgett has given us a fine portrait of Lou as the architect of that iconic research entity, and his comments on the nature of Lou's mentorship closely echo those of both Bob Phillips and Ron Wharton and speak volumes about the character of the man we are honoring today. Character is a good segue, I think, to the more personal snapshots we've been given by Jim Friesen and Kathy Siminovitch. I can only dimly imagine those 6 wonderful years in Paris, aptly described by Kathy as a cultural and scientific mecca in that post-war period. From Jim comes the wonderful characterization of Eleanor as Lou's cultural tutor, along with many memories of Lou's love of theater, opera, and ballet, and his increasingly focused musical tastes. Above all, Kathy, we thank you for your stunning and very moving word portrait of Lou and Eleanor as parents and role models who gave you and your sisters a Renaissance childhood. In the words of our excellent MC, John Dirks, Lou Siminovitch has pursued a lifelong, relentless, unapologetic quest for excellence. Today, in his 101st year, Lou Siminovitch is still going to the office, still reading Science and Nature in the New York Review of Books, and still on that quest for excellence. But while Lou can be a tough critic with exacting standards, he's made so many friends all over the world, and that reflects not just his extraordinary intellect and wide range of interests, but Lou's personal warmth and his innate generosity of spirit. Those latter attributes are reflected in a lifetime of writing reference letters, of sending kind and supportive notes, acknowledging the milestones of colleagues, and the innumerable nominations that Lou Siminovitch has initiated to advance others for some award or honor, and in his manifest concern and compassion when some illness or tragedy befalls those in his wide circle of friends. That same generosity has made Lou a valued mentor to emerging scientific leaders and to scores of scientists in Canada and abroad. All these individuals are an integral part of Lou's giant legacy. And while it is very clear that the Siminovitch genotype is totally unique, Lou's epigenetic influences will continue to be propagated to researchers for generations to come. Lou, as you like to say, you're still here, and we are all overjoyed to be here with you, celebrating a life so rich and impactful that it is hard to imagine just one amazing person living it. Thank you, Lou Siminovitch.
Thank you, David, for summarizing so well and so accurately and so lovingly. It's time for Lou to respond in his 101st year. This picture was taken around May 1st, and actually, having just visited him yesterday, he looks even better than that. Let's hear from Lou.
I'm very grateful to John Dirks, Peter Copeland, and everyone else who contributed to this tribute honoring my achievements. Of course, such achievements do not stand alone, and I want to acknowledge some of the many elements that have been integral to any achievements I've had. Where would I be without my nuclear family, which my late wife, Eleanor, developed and nursed, and in which she played such a seminal role. To my daughters, their spouses, and my grandchildren, I love you all, and my life would be barren without you. I've also been blessed to be crossed paths and been enormously enriched by the collegiality and close relationships with everyone who spoke today, and with so many other individuals from the lay public, and from the scientific, academic, cultural, and business worlds. They have been a constant source of friendship, guidance, wisdom, encouragement, stimulation, and support so crucial to both success and my personal gratification. I've also been so fortunate to have the influence of a number of wonderful mentors, individuals who provided unlimited support, but also allowed me infinite degrees of freedom to spread my wings. And I, in turn, have derived immeasurable satisfaction to have been able to continue that tradition with my own trainees and with several others for whom I was responsible. This brings me to a few words about my dear late wife, Eleanor. Unquestionably, my most important mentor. I was fortunate that Eleanor chose me as her partner and then stuck with me for over 50 years. She was a bastion of support during some very difficult times for her, particularly in the early years. Eleanor was always the source of immeasurable enrichment by her love, compassion, and so many other indefinable qualities. She epitomized the centrality of social and ethical responsibility, the importance of the culture beyond that of science, and the richness of family that I mentioned earlier. I have been, and I'm a lucky camper. I've had a ball.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank all of you for being with us tonight. I'm sorry for glitches that might have taken place. These are part of our new technology, but I want to thank the Toronto Medical Historical Club for stimulating this talk and for Peter Copland doing so much of the work in enlisting people to attend. And I thank the Department of Molecular Genetics, the chairman, Dr. Leah Cowan, and Diane Wells for their help, and all of our speakers, Bob Phillips, Ron Wharton, Jim Woodgett, Ken Knox, Kathy Siminovitch, Jim Friesen, and David Naylor. Gary Goldberg deserves special thanks for generously supporting this Lou Siminovitch tribute. And we've been very thankful to Heather Bannister and the whole team here at the MS group at the University of Toronto. And Kathy Siminovitch has been a great help and inspiration to me while trying to put this together. And Peggy Lau and Mary He were special in assisting me in preparing this tribute. I always need lots of technical support. If you wish, you can send on the Q&A column a comment, a memory of you. Thank you very much for being with us this evening. Lou, may he live for a long time.